Okay. Okay. So I just want to make sure that people there can hear if I. Okay, I don't want that transcript. Okay, I'm asking people who are online if they can hear me to put up their hand if they can hear me. Huh? Surely. Okay, right. Gian. Gian or Diane? Dion. Okay, right. You can hear me even though I don't have the ears in. Good. Okay, lovely. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so now we are being recorded. If you have any questions, type them in the chat box that you see on your screen there, and I will come to them at the end of each section, sort of thing. Okay. Out of here. All right, so. Okay, so it's week 5. Just quite astonishing. How are you feeling about your assignment?
Which one? Yeah, one's for the big one.
The big one.
No, the big one mentioned is coming together.
Oh, good.
I think for me, when you first saw the assignment at the beginning, you didn't like thinking. Yeah, what about this? So now that we've had like multiple times engaging around changing it's starting to take shape and make like, oh, okay, this is what this is this is where I'm moving toward and yeah, that is that question.
Yeah, it's yes, I mean, that's what I look to do, is get to thinking all the time, because otherwise you don't want to, I mean, what I've been favorite is that I know it's really fast about and forget why I'm reading it. Yeah, and then it's very difficult to then come back to the places. Yeah, there usually about 7 people who come, but they're often arrive on the ladies' All right, so what we're going to cover in this lecture is to look at the emergence of those early trade unions. We're jumping in from the 1920s, where we're going to start. What I want you to try and see as we go through it is issues or points of organizational strength, how that was developed or not developed, and where that strength came from in the various different forms of unions that emerged. Also, consider again the use of official channels versus the use of worker power. And by worker power, I mean strike action and protest action. And this again, ties into the current situation of looking at unions now and the fact that COSATU is tied into very formal methods or formal channels of communication that perhaps make it very difficult to maintain worker engagement and worker participation. Mobilizing tactics in different contexts. That mobilizing in some cases was through publicizing the gains that you had made, the wage increases that you had secured for people. In other contexts, it was workers committees in factories themselves. In other cases, it was tying into community organizations, certainly later on. So just keep an eye out for that. Political and national interests versus the focus on worker interests and factory base. Okay, this comes up very strongly, as does the next point, participatory democracy versus representative leadership. It comes up towards the end of the Baskin lead. Don't stop before you've read the end. I mean, literally, Baskin talks about the emergence of trade unions, and halfway through, he starts at the 1970s. And this lecture said before the 1970s. So I'm quite understanding if people stopped at that point and said, well, now he's going on to talk about the 70s. The thing is that it's very good, his argument. Okay. And particularly that he draws out that issue of the political national interests of national liberation. Okay? So that political national interest would have been the armed struggle, would have been the liberation struggle in South Africa. As well, they're not opposed, but it's the degree of prioritizing. Okay, do you and you'll see how. At different times, unions prioritize workers' interests in factory base, or this political and national, the liberation movement and communism. Yeah, and particularly in the Second World War. And the feasibility there for participatory democracy versus representative leadership. As soon as you walking. When you go away from that deep focus on worker interests in the factory base, all of a sudden you have other interests to concern yourself with. And one of the things that comes up, which is very true in Baskin, is that the unions which emerged, or the community organizations rather than emerged over the 1980s, they couldn't deal with the proper participatory process. It was too slow. They need to make decisions quickly, and the whole thing of consulting, they just couldn't deal with it, right? But that immediately, it undermines worker control if there isn't actually any space for worker participation. I'm not sure that there's that they could have done otherwise. They operated in a particular context.
So you're saying that because they needed to kind of get it to came across, they said was something of the lines of working conditions, and they needed to kind of make that wages.
No, community organisation. Yeah, because in the 1980s, what happened was that there was an increasing move of trade unions to integrate and to work together with community organizations around the protests for liberation.
Okay.
So that sort of thing. So it was on that side, organizing of protests, organizing of marches, stagaways, boycotts, those sorts of things. The decisions were taken very quickly without consultation.
And consultation was
no, the opportunities for consultation weren't great. There was consultation among small groups, but that's of course underground. That it was exceptionally difficult to couldn't really make sure that everyone participated and knew about it. Yeah. Okay. And then just to remind you that your question is, what issues or areas of life trade unions acted in before the 1970s? And then how did this shape their role in the liberation of South Africa? All right. So here, what you could look at trade unions, what sort of things did trade unions do, and look at it purely from the perspective of what they did as trade unions. Or you could say, well, you're going to look at trade unions in terms of the workers that they were representing. So that when, there were occasions where workers were more militant than the unions wanted them to be, right? And you could say, okay, workers were organizing around this. They wanted to act around these issues. So you could look at, I mean, you've already got 600 words, so I don't think that you could look at it from both sides. But if you look at it purely from the trade union side, it might be a little bit limited as to what you can say, right? Because when we end in 1970, it's trade unions are pretty much saying we can't have anything to do with politics, right? Which was not what happened as they went forward. So, yeah. We could discuss the difficulties, as you'll see, of perhaps why they tried to do this, they were involved with that, and that then shaped their response, that it wasn't successful and wasn't always successful. They were criticized very heavily for getting involved in that liberation. Are you looking more worried? You're all right. No. Okay. It'll make sense as we go on, I hope. All right. Okay, so we start with the ICU. And here we have the first instance of this where the ICU was the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, all right? But the way that people understood it was ICU, as in ICU doing things and exploiting black people, black workers. ICU not recognizing my rights. Okay, so immediately there it was a case of yes, the union, the union is there, but the reality is that people are living a particular life. Yeah. So the ICU was a general union, and much it was driven by personalities. Clemens Kadali was a very charismatic, yes, charismatic personality. And he organized people and gave these immense, these amazing speeches and worked up support. But he worked up support wherever he went and accepted everyone and anyone as members of ICU. So he would go through rural areas. There was a large number, well, a significant portion of his membership was from farm workers and labor tenants. Okay, this is the 1920s. They have recently, over the last 20 years, they've had their land taken out from under them. They, what used to be small farmers were taking produce to the city, who were earning money, who were, sending their children overseas. We're no longer doing that, yeah?
So, I'm not sure if I'm out of this topic. Can we compare Kagine to Julius when he started EFF? He was all over the place, was very charismatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was it in
Exactly, yes. Of charismatic personality is it's in many sense necessary in politics.
Yeah.
But his very general focus, he was organizing, and he was also the period at point in time. But what he was mobilizing was opposition to the loss of land rights, opposition to this increasing white exclusionary policies. So rather than being focused on any particular sector, it was a very widespread engagement. And because of that, they didn't have the resources to fully address all the people that they were mobilizing, right? They had this enormously rapid growth in members. Sorry about it. I wonder if I can just move that track.
Just trying to move the little thing that shows that you're online. Ah, okay. And then make that small.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, 100,000 in, where were we? We can get it off for a moment. 100,000 members, they estimated, these were not paid up members, but this is what they estimated by the end of 1927. So it was incredibly fast over the 10 years. And more on personalities than on actual organization, even though it started from the dockworkers in Cape Town. Okay, the situation that they came into was the early 1900s Job Reservation Act started. And also, I mean, the moves to remove land, to take away land that was owned by Black people, or second by Black people, started in like the 1880s. Because as soon as the discovery of gold and diamonds brought hordes of people into urban areas, there was a market. And when there was a market, the settlers who had title to land, they had been given land as settlers by their governments. The government settled and said, okay, well, you buy land from me now. So they owned this land, but they had never wanted to plant because there was no, there was no real market. Now with this increase in urbanization, they wanted to go back and take advantage of this. So those sorts of policies were then brought in to restrict land ownership by Black people, to make Black people into workers rather than, even the red tenancy was progressively phased out. So, yeah. But yeah, so then in the 1900s, this issue of protecting white settlers, looking after the economic interests of white settlers rather, as opposed to Black people, was very evident throughout there. Yeah. So job reservation started from that point. 1922, miners came back, the white miners came, well, white people who'd gone to fight the First World War came back and found that there was increasing reliance on Black people in the mines, in skilled positions. So they opposed this vehemently and they went into a strike. Strangely enough, it was a communist strike. They were communists who were trying to effect a revolution for communism. But the idea of communism did not include Black people. Right? It was white workers unite. And they literally, that was the white workers of the world unite. Yeah, so you have in 1922 the white miners' strike. As part of the response to that, the Industrial Conciliation Act in 1924 established industrial councils. So in sectors where there were several businesses, several industries, or many factories, or more than one enterprise, okay, they would set up industrial councils that would decide for that sector, for that particular industry, around wage negotiations, employment conditions, etc., etc. And through those, they excluded African workers from having any access to skilled jobs. So they made sure that what happened over the 1900s, during the war, when the Black people took over the skilled jobs, would never happen again. Furthermore, they excluded African unions from collective bargaining structures. Surprisingly, what they left behind were the wage boards, because if you couldn't establish industrial councils, if there weren't enough enterprises in a particular sector, we've just started making shoes, okay, so there's only one factory, there's only one company, then it would be wage boards that then decided on minimum wages and conditions of work and things like that. They established with the industrial councils, they excluded black workers, but they didn't exclude black workers from the wage workers, which was the first entry into this official, not the start of the official.
What is a wage?
The wage board is a group of officials who decided on minimum wages in particular for particular jobs and grades. Yeah, and races. Yeah. Okay. Now, I see you organizing in this time was, they were very, they weren't successful, and there are strong criticisms of them that they didn't make enough from the grassroots support that they had, that they could have done a far better job. But the laws that were being passed at the time made it very difficult. Clements Kadani was prevented from moving around by the task force. So he, in his very, charismatic speeches, was then no longer able to travel around the country. Also, those past laws had tied urban rights for Black people to jobs. And because of that, it made the position as an employed Black person much more important. And to risk that through a strike action, you were risking more than just a job. You were risking your ability to be in an urban area. The task force laws weren't quite as bad then as they became later. They started to implement them much more strictly. But they were still unpleasant, and you didn't want to have that hanging over your head. So their bargaining power was significantly weakened. The Native Administration Act of 1927 criminalized the promotion of racial hostility, and of course, if you are organizing Black workers to ask for better conditions of work or higher pay, that is inciting racial hate. And then they had the righteous assemblies, where you could be removed from an area if you did. So all sorts of, holding meetings and that sort of thing was all of a sudden under control and restricted. The argument is that they didn't have the resources to service the enormous number of people who were their followers. And in that context, the racial laws made it exceptionally difficult for them to move around, to do anything around organizing, but also made it kind of, it would have been very difficult in those times to have a strictly worker-focused union. The kinds of changes that were happening then, there were Black people who were urbanized, there were urban populations, there was brewing beer firms that women were involved in, and they were becoming established business people through this. And the government was moving in and shutting down everything. Okay? And they took the beer firms and they said, right, we run the beer firms now. And they then took the profits rather than the women who previously were there. So you have this normal population emerging in the 1900s that all, at this time were having all of their daily life undermined, okay, and attacked. So, to really concentrate only on worker issues or only urban workers was very difficult. Yeah. Philip Bonner argues that is too kind of an assessment, that in fact there were 837,000 African workers in commercial enterprises in urban areas, that they didn't organize, that they didn't make an attempt, they didn't develop leadership, They didn't establish structures on the shop floor. They relied on charismatic speeches and negotiations with the state and individual employers. Are you okay with that? Yeah. Okay, so by the 1930s, they were pretty much over. Then the next one that is very important in the 1930s was the Joint Committee of African Trade Unions. Now, the 1930s again was,
Sorry, yeah, so you're saying in that period of 20 or the 1930s, trade unionism kind of fell away to a degree because it was didn't have a leader. It was leader and organizationally,
all right,
structurally wasn't really.
at the same time, there's the Communist Party who was organizing at the time. So the Communist Party was involved in the 1922 strikes. ANC was involved. They had a degree of negotiation with the Communist Party, although I don't think that it started out particularly well. So they were organizing workers,
But not as a trade.
They didn't become big enough to talk about now,
Okay.
pretty much. I mean, but there were other, I mean, the next person we'll look at is.
But it was the ICU that kind of felt that collapsed.
Yeah,
It's not really
but
good.
ICU just was such an important thing because it had such popular appeal. But I mean, Ghana Makabeni, who in 1942 eventually got together, well, he didn't get together by himself, but he was then president or general secretary of the Council of Non-European Trade Unions. He was organizing in the 1920s as well. So it's like what we're picking out here is the major people. Well, not the major, well, it is people. But there's a strong criticism and a very valid criticism against that emphasis on people. We're just picking out the highlights. So the Joint Committee of African Trade Unions. There was also this time, let me carry on. So they used industry-specific unionism. Person who ran this, and this Max Gordon, was, I think he was British. He came up with a firm Trotskyite position, and he was very opposed to the Communist Party. So he resisted anything to do with the Communist, because our Communist Party always had strong ties to the Leninists, Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist position. Okay. The Trotskyite position would have been more along the lines of you need a broad dissemination of consciousness across society. You need to build workers across divisions in order to move forward to communism in the future. Okay? The idea of being able to implement communism in one country, Trotsky argued, was not possible. So Max Gordon was pretty conservative, but he was very good at negotiating the existing channels to represent workers, well, to improve the position of workers, particularly the wage bill. And of course, the Department of Labour was delighted to have someone willing to work with them, because they also were looking at the growing African Union movement, and they had no way, they had no official way that they were able to engage. So they were very pleased, and they went out their way to make sure that he had gains that he could then rely on. But ultimately, it collapsed because it was so dependent on him. And when he then opposed the involvement in the war, okay, being a Trotsky, he didn't run to defend Russia when Germany invaded Russia. He took a position against the war that he didn't want. He thought that South Africa should not be involved. And because of that, he was given a prisoner of war camp in turn. So on board. And the whole thing collapsed because he had done nothing to build local structures. All he'd been doing was negotiating by himself at the top level. He didn't consult effectively. The emerging unionists within black workers that were emerging who tried to take more active role. He went out of his way to exclude them, to prevent them from having more influence and being able to develop leadership. Essentially, the argument is that the workers just became clients of an advice office. So the union was pretty much just an advice office where you would go along and do your best to solve the problem.
So could you say that in this case, bureaucracy would have helped them to a degree because that would have been more organized? Like if there was particularly formalization of procedure, if he wasn't there, then technically that union or how it's been phrased, would it still exist?
It would still exist. Exactly. Bureaucracy would have enabled it to continue. It would have established processes, as you say. Yes. Yeah, of course, the processes then relied on people to come into those positions at that level, because there were positions in the factory. You know, it wasn't a factory-based organization, it was at a higher level. So it really, I mean, even if new people moved in, it would have been the intelligentsia moving into these new positions. It wouldn't have been workers moving in. So ultimately, that issue of worker participation and leadership would have become definitive. Yeah. It's also, I mean, he was vehemently opposed to anything to do with the communists. So that when the communists did become involved, and he tried to set up new branches of unions, and then he elected them to Parliament. He excluded them all and threw them out of the party, and then he asked the English and British unions to come out and give him help. And when they disagreed with him, he threw them out. And yeah, so it wasn't, yeah, it wasn't, yeah, it wasn't a good start. Okay, 1942.
Sorry, I think that's just breaking my brain a little bit because if he was necessarily like he was against communists, obviously the Leninists, but what I think I just perhaps just have a sense of communist thinking when it comes to a union. You just kind of almost those two concepts of
Unity,
almost. Typically, that's what you think. So then where do you sit on the scope? Because against communism, but for the people. So, I mean, it was a kind of building a worker culture and a working class sense of identity that he was after. Okay. He was after organizing workers around their common interests, all right, for a future, but a future that he didn't see. He saw the Communist Party and their linkages to Stalin particularly, and Lenin. Stalin was much later. He saw that as diametrically opposed to his interests. He wanted the British Labour Party kind of unionism here. That's what he set out to do. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's they just seem like those two concepts are
yeah.
they come together.
I think it's that they are violent. You know, there's strong opposition in different readings of Marx, even amongst communists. So that it's and it had very real, personal implications of being eliminated, disappearing, following the party line. rather than doing what you think is correct. And he was, he liked being in that position of power, of doing what he thought what he was sure was correct. And, the skills that he had, he wasn't about to start sharing them and towing a party line. Okay, so the 1940s were significantly better than trade union organization. You had the outbreak of the war in 1939. So once again, when people left, the white people left because they were allowed to carry guns. The Africans conscripts weren't allowed to carry guns. They weren't all conscripts. There were African volunteers who went to both wars, but in neither war were they allowed to carry any guns. So there wasn't a great rush from, African people to join South Africa's war effort. They were well aware that they would just be cannon fodder. But yes, so the white workers predominantly went to work. And again, there was a need for skilled labor, and they went to the black workers, the African workers, who then filled that out. And with the war effort, war is great for the economy, so you had this, flourishing of activity. You had to start making goods that you previously used to import because you couldn't import them any longer at factories and everything was shut down. So, there was manufacturing in South Africa that took off, and mining was still very important. The emerging, the factory base needed skilled machine workers. And they were quite happy to take African people. And they were able to do it. So, and of course, the government also kind of played along with this. They kind of held off on the implementation of the draconian laws. They allowed registered unions that already existed, that organized white workers, to also become involved in organizing black unions. So that there was another channel for unions to engage, for black unions to engage with these official structures. And of course, those unions saw it as at last, that this was the opportunity. This was the political opportunity that they saw, and they wanted to make the most of it. And how they did that was by being reasonable, by trying to stop their members from striking, by accepting gentlemen's agreements and handshakes on deals, accepting promises rather than anything in writing, on the basis that it was in good faith. And they were. The level of good faith was, and I think same thing's happening with Croatia. Not Croatia. Sorry? Ukraine. Thank you. Yeah. That with the Second World War, initially the communists weren't interested until Germany invaded the USSR. Well, until Germany invaded Russia. And then they were all up against it as well. So they too turned around and said, well, we can't strike. We've got to go and support the war effort. We've got to go and protect Russia. So they also, those communists that were involved in the trade union movements, were also saying to the workers and to the unions, you can't strike now. You can't mobilize, even though the workers were quite aware that this was the time of their power. And finally, they had these jobs, they had improved conditions of work, they had massive increases in wages relative to what they were. But the unions wouldn't, the unions didn't go along with this. Well, because in the level of commitment to saving Russia and doing away with Hitler, okay, was really extreme. It was and to the point that in colonies generally, okay, that was a time of colonies, and colonies were still trying to get independence from colonial powers, Germany, including England and Italy and France and everything else. And the argument was raised that this was the right time actually to go for independence, to take advantage of the white European powers fighting each other and to kick them out of the country to establish independence. And the Communist Party and the ANC at that organization then, but they agreed that it would be a bad thing to do if it meant doing it at the cost of Russia. So they didn't support it. It's not like they could have, if they supported it, it would have happened. But it was, yes, they wanted liberation, but they didn't feel that it was okay to fight for it if the fight for that would be undermining Russia and communism. So yeah, you look at Ukraine now and how we are pussyfooting around it.
So was that a missed opportunity?
I don't know if it was an opportunity, but I think, more than anything, some students years ago said to me, my God, you white people are precious. And it's like, it's the goodwill. It's like playing nicely and not taking advantage of your enemy when they're our enemies. Which, yeah, is kind of like, we should have. Yeah, they should have. I don't know if it would have been successful, who knows?
Yeah, maybe it wasn't at the time, but
Yeah, so they came back and implemented, the grand apartheid thing. After, what I said,
yeah.
after fighting fascism, after fighting against Hitler, and being all for human rights and everything else. So maybe it's a case of absolute disbelief that they can still have those attitudes. But the thing was that it wasn't they didn't believe that black people were less. They knew that they wanted to protect their interests, and they looked at black people and said they are the enemy. They are competing for our jobs. They are competing for our land. We want to protect our interests as white people. The whole racism and that believing in a less is a deeper kind of insidious ideology. And here at this time, it's just quite there in your face, that black people are taking over your jobs. They are doing your skilled work. You can't very well turn around and say that they are not skilled. During apartheid, yes, they did. If a black person did the job, it was not skilled. Even if the job we would generally consider it to be skilled, it would be classified as not skilled. So, yeah, it was a sense of unity, I suppose. So unity with the communist allies that they were fighting to protect communism. Wow.
Message.
Yeah. So the war measures, yes, the war measures came in to, on the one hand, stop people striking, which had limited success, and on the other hand, to enable African unions to be part of official arbitration around wages, around conditions. Again, extreme situation, like was the war measure, specifically rather than a change of position. This movement and this time, the emergence, the level of mobilization on the ground was actually quite it's hard to say. I mean, it wasn't taken up by the unions. There was a lot of militancy and a lot of power on the floor that they could have taken, but they didn't. They deliberately, I mean, they tried to shut that power down in the interest of the war effort. But that power had been stirred, so that was where your Black, your African unionists came from to the rest of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. They were cultivated through these movements, on the shop floor from a very organic position, rather than coming from outside. So it was good in terms of that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the decline of Sonetu was once again, war ends, the white workers come back, industry slumps, so there's no longer a war out there, but everyone is poor, white workers come back, they have nothing, the state goes into providing housing for them, the area around Emmerich. Currently, Emmerich is part of a farm owned by a single person who then gave large areas of land to the white soldiers who were returning for their houses. So, yeah, so it was that kind of, it was these enormous number of people coming back and coming back to literally start again. So things weren't great at all. And in this situation, the largest union in Sonetu's stable was the African mine workers. And they've been fighting for years and years for recognition. I forget who it was from. The Chamber of Mines. They were fighting for the Chamber of Mines to recognize them. So all through the 1940s, up until this period, they had been doing the skilled jobs and they had been organizing and they had been petitioning the Chamber of Mines to please recognize them as unions, as African unions. And the Chamber of Mines was just refusing at every step. So in 1946, AMU went on strike, 70,000 members went on strike, and it was crushed in a particularly bloody and nasty way. And they were forced back underground to work. But 12 people were killed, 1,200 were injured, and that was the start. I mean, first of all, the workers then saw this, that they had struck and had this terrible defeat. The union hadn't been, the Sonetu hadn't been able to provide any meaningful help. And it was, it was a time that clearly things had changed. The unionists and the Communist Party members were convicted of contravening war measures, so they were arrested. In 1950, the Communist Party was banned in South Africa. So their leadership was imprisoned or removed. And then in 1948, you have the National Party voted into power, who then goes out to crush African resistance, to protect the white workers, the white people who voted them in, on a ticket of white nationalism. Yeah. Okay, so decline of Sonetu. All right, so apart from of the enormous state oppression, the argument is that they didn't take advantage of the workers, that there was labor power, there was worker power that was there, and they ignored it. Like, they let it go to waste. And this very opportune time where they had militancy, they had militant workers behind them, and they had a receptive state and receptive employers, they lost it, yeah. Their strategy of trying to get access to the official channels and to recognition from employers meant that they were talking to those people, they were talking to capital, they were talking to the state. They weren't, they were asking the state, they were expecting that to be reasonable rather than saying they had to, they would represent, their power was not in being reasonable. Their power was in worker mobilization. Yeah,
What did you say about the equality?
about that economic interest.
Oh, the econ.
Oh, the economic. Yeah, I looked up there and it's like there's one plan, but I'm scared to turn it off and there's no indication. No, it's not.
Can't imagine.
Okay, I will put you down as a special request. Technology sorted, I think. Okay. So the lessons from that was, first of all, that you have to actually be strategic about where your strength comes from. That worker power is something that is the power of the union, and you need to develop that, and that it's easier to develop and to maintain strong unions if you have fewer unions and more members rather than many unions with very little members. And of course, that the fastest growing is not necessarily the organization that manages to survive.
I mean, that's one thing, obviously. I mean, it's all topic is all new to me, so, the thoughts of having a general union versus having a very specialized union, like, native workers, for example.
That's it.
Obviously, a general union in the 1920s when, Kidali, he was doing that, that was more of a, like for the fact that people were being taken care of in general versus a very specific industry problem.
Yeah.
So, but then you get something like, so you're saying that we've got lots of trade unions with little members. It's better to have bigger general trade union with more members.
Yeah, no, rather to have specific unions, but not to have a different union in every factory.
Okay.
To, have
This is the organization.
yeah. This,
Mobilization.
more recognition that workers are your strength, but that you need to consolidate your base. You need to build an identity, you need to build structures, you need to build that feeding process so that when your union leaders are imprisoned, the union still can continue to work.
Because I mean, is that like how the alignment with COSATU is beneficial for smaller unions? Like having the alignment with bigger
Yes,
is more powerful for organization.
Yeah.
Mobilization.
I think at the moment, we have a lot of unions in South Africa. Okay, I think that we have around 160. It is considered a huge number. This with a much smaller population. Okay, 1940s was, where are we? 119 unions. Okay, it was 40% of workers in commercial and in commerce and industry in 1945. So it was a significant number of them. But, you know, we have probably 3 times the number of workers now at least. And we have 160 unions, and that is too much. You know, it's regarded as too much. They had 119 unions that they were trying to pull.
So it's way more dispersed, actually.
Yeah.
And you can't negotiate like, when there's many unions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, you know, we can stretch from 10 to 15. Versus exactly and saying they are representing 80,000 members.
Yes.
And you know, you can bring the country shutdown, you
Yeah.
bring the country, it's like the country shutdown. Now, if it's just a small, like if I'm supposed to say that bring a shutdown, the national shutdown, like, I think was there something that was to happen today? That's why they're talking everywhere.
There was a distinct lack of, but I had looked at the email, so I never got the email because we actually agreed not to have a class today. I didn't email this morning. No, I'm just the person who's doing the full-time students. So I contacted him yesterday. He got back to me yesterday, but I didn't look at emails.
So you can't answer for nothing.
Yeah, he cancelled his class. But then it's kind of like, and then he said, well, you know, it's not particular to Joe, the shopping marches are happening in other areas.
But I mean, that's like that's today is a good example of how
Yeah.
various people are coming together to make a very big
And very-
point.
Yeah.
And you've got someone like Kasatu and Sven Zima, ex-Kasatu, coming together
Yeah.
to
And
try and make a point.
yes, and I mean, they're coming together, but I mean, they're not really coming
Coming
together.
together. They're not aligned.
Yeah, and you know, it's a bit confusing, they're mixed signals and, yeah. Although there were far fewer people on campus. I just, you know, I mean, when I was at school, we used to send out messages for the, you know, we'd be like the university or faculty say. They send out messages saying this is the situation, and go, you cannot go. Yeah, and then obviously you can do whatever you need to do. But I didn't feel, you know, it was like I searched on Vixen's internet site to find some sort of recognition that this was happening. It's nothing.
So crazy.
Yeah. No. Yesterday I was awful, not having the leg. Yeah, and then Chantal flies up, so it's like, you know, it's kind of like, well, she's flying up, so I'm not coming here. That's an issue. Yeah. But yes, it's a good example of the way that even around very important issues where you have got a lot of support, you're willing to stay away. And it's easy to stay away as well. It's not like it's willing to march through the streets. So all of us are quite happy to do it. But with mixed signals and no consistent message, it's undermined. Although there were very few people around. So, yeah, I think so. Okay. Right, so then we move on to the 1960s. We're going to finish sooner than normal.
I promise you see. I could get back some sleep. That'll be good. Yeah, very exciting. I think I've talked some today. It's
Okay, so I mean, all right, so at the end, we will highlight, I will ask you to highlight points that are relevant for your assignment, the big assignment and the short pieces. Okay, so SAC2 emerged 1955. You had the grand apartheid in 1948 with the election, and the legislation then followed that there was the Bantu Labour Settlement of Disputes Act that established factory worker committees. And that was the means through which African workers would be represented. And how they were represented was that one of the people employed at the Bantu Labour Office, a white person who worked at the Bantu Labour Office, would be sitting on those committees to speak on behalf of African workers. Okay, so it was, it was an attempt to take away, rid of power and influence. The Industrial Conciliation Act amended, the amendment to that act meant that you couldn't register as a mixed union. So all of those unions which had unofficially taken to representing African unions and working with African unions, all of a sudden were faced with this decision of, well, you are not going to maintain your registration unless you revert back to your racially distinct groupings of, well, it was white, colored and Indian people were allowed to be trade union members. African people weren't allowed to be trade union members. So what had been, at this point, with the 1940s, there had been a gradual move from existing white union bodies, like the Trade Union Council of South Africa, TACSA, okay? And the trades and labour councils that had been representing African unions and assisting and providing means of representation, who then all jumped up and said, yes, we firmly support your idea. That led to the collapse of the trades and labour councils. TACSA, the Trade Union Council of South Africa, they also supported this move to no longer represent African unions, although there were some unions, registered unions, i.e. formerly white unions or Indian coloured unions, who didn't go to TACSA, who left and together with Sonetu formed SAC2. So the union, the framework of unions, that institutional structure, was changing to recognize and to respond to the fact that Black workers, African workers, were unionized, right? So change was happening. With these changes in legislation and the change in the interests of the white South African government and government of South Africa, they switched right back. Government made the call, you cannot have racially mixed unions, and instead of saying, right, well, then we will no longer stay registered, they said, oh, okay then. And even the 14 unions that didn't stay with TACSA, those 14 unions said no, TACSA executives supported this and said, right, we no longer support Black unions or African workers. So there were official registered unions who said, no, well, then we're not part of TUC, so we're going to form our own organization in SACTU. But still they remained registered. Let me just, okay. So the registration debate, it was over this issue that yes, SACTU was formed and included these, unions who kept registration, in which case they formally represented only white union or only Indian or coloured workers, but they would not, they aligned themselves with SACTU and they said, no, that's where we go. But the argument was that they should deregister to record their disagreements and their opposition to the amendment. Their argument was that they could still use the official machinery, they could still use the official channels, they could do it on behalf, but unofficially help African workers and their unions, and that they should continue this. The other side of the argument was that not only are you collaborating with this oppressive situation, but for all of your work through the legal channels and the existing channels of negotiation through the 1940s, you didn't do anything about the workers who had the militancy. You missed that chance of organizing from the ground. So in fact, we don't want to use these official channels because we can. It undermines our help. It was recognition that official channels were just actually, that was, barking up the wrong tree. It was that the government was never going to recognize them through official channels. They were never going to be able to, with things like playing by the rules to the extent of applying for legal permission to have strikes. And it was that they had played by the rules, and all of their attempts to play by the rules hadn't worked. And they recognized that they were never going to have this change in attitude. They were never going to have the employers who had seemed so reasonable and so accepting, and during the war, that they weren't going to then stand up and say, okay, well, we recognize these African unions. So the individual employers weren't going to do this. And they realized that what they did have was power of workers on the floor. That was their only strength that they could really rely on. So what SACTU then focused on was building strong factory committees. And they were very effective at that. And trying to win bargaining rights and recognition from employers on an informal basis, on a company by company, on a factory by factory basis.
How shop stewards started.
Yeah, well, yes, but okay, this would have integrated shop stewards and relied heavily on shop stewards to build these factory committees. But this was a major change in the approach to tactics of mobilization, to tactics of worker representation. That, at this point it was, the recognition that the path that they had been treading for the previous 30, 40 years was not going to work. And it happened in this context, it was very clear. And from their very start, they took a clearly political position. They said there's no way that you can separate national liberation from workers' rights. That you can't be a trade union. You can't pretend that you are, it would be meaningless to fight for labor rights at work when in fact the exploitation was, the exploitation was rooted in deeper structures. It was rooted in structures of relying on the African woman to subsidize this by, the reproduction of labor, the people who were ensuring that the laborer lived from one day to the next. And that in 10 years' time, there were new laborers ready to stand up and take the place of people who died. That was being subsidized by Black women. They were the ones doing the work and working extra. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the wages, they didn't get the income to do it easily. So they worked 3 times as hard in order to compensate for the wages that were being earned by people in the household that did have jobs in commercial areas. The cost of adequate schooling for your children, again, would have been another means, another effect of this labor inequality, this, the overall racial inequality that just went into everything. And I think it's best said in that first quote, that you can't separate politics and the way people are governed from their bread and butter or their freedom to move to and from places where they can find the best employment. And this is it. If you can't move to find employment, you're not just a worker. That's not any other worker, that is recognized in other countries.
And that bears a semblance of slavery.
Yeah.
With slavery, you were tied to your plantation. It's just to see how
At least,
that oppressive mindset also.
yes.
Yeah. To a lesser degree, yes.
Yeah.
But the concept of you cannot move. When you are tied to this owner that you have here. And the owner that we have was the customers. The customers tied you to Joburg. And the minute when you try to move out of Joburg, you must have new customers, you must stand there to go to Cape Town. And that restriction over there of controlling the movement. Because I know, for example, my uncle, my mother was sharing with us that there was a point where he wanted to kill himself because of the frustration of the past laws for him. I think he was born in Schweizer. My grandmother was in Johannesburg. He could not come here and get a job because of the fact that he was not allowed to be supposed to be in that one. And there was just that whole rigmarole. And he was so frustrated by the inability to just get economic activity that he wanted to kill himself.
It's human freedom. It's human activity. It's the ability to move around.
Yeah, and we understand that that's tying of politics and worker rights. That really, the worker rights were within the framework that was created by
each other and really close to each other. Yes. Yeah.
So this would this be the start of tripartite?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, this is where they decided to take to align themselves firmly with the Congress movement and the Communist Party to fight for liberation.
Because I like this when you said it's like you cannot separate someone's means of living from politics. I would have thought about if you think about trade unions, you always think, oh man, why am I making politics into this? It's just like people are getting a job and like just look after the people, man. It's all we need to do. Why do we need to bring into politics? Oh wait. Okay.
Yeah, and that if you could get the job and go and find another, yes, wherever it was.
I mean, today,
That wouldn't have been,
today, you go, hey, you bring the politics into this. But you have to, it's really fun.
that point is, because also the ability of, the reproduction of labor is always what gets me, is that, and if you live in a nice area, it is less expensive to live. You don't need to worry about gangs getting your children. You can You don't need to send them to after school places or to boarding schools or private schools. You just have them there. You don't need to travel to do grocery shopping because, there isn't a large shop in your area because it doesn't have electricity. But it's like all of those things that make it more difficult or less difficult to live depending on the services that your government provides. This is it, public services. If it takes you 3 days to get to a hospital, or if it takes you a couple of hours.
And you see, Christine, even with that, you look at how town planning evolved with that. But if you think about the fact that Joburg is close to Sophia town, and people could save the cost of transport by walking to work.
And that's why there was economic development. That's why there was this growing, vibrant urban community coming up because people naturally, poor people live close to the place of work.
Correct.
If you live close to the place of work, your money, all of a sudden, you've got extra money to spend. So you spend more money.
Correct.
You buy things from people. Now today's there's more abundance.
Yeah. Now we live far, and when you think about the fact that in your 5,000 rands that you earn from retail, 2,500 rands of that money is taken.
That's like there isn't a city in the world that smiles like that. Every other city, the city is where the poor people live because that is, and then as you get wealthier, you move on to outside.
Exactly. It's like, that is really true. That is so true.
And no, what you've done is take poor people and say, you go as far away as possible. And then you wonder why you don't have no common. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's tremendously frustrating, but that's my hope with the basic income grant. Give people money. People spend money, and that is what creates jobs. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the statute took that very, very strong political position. But the darker decade of the 1960s. 1957. Okay, so 1957, they established that they were dealing with the Congress Alliance. And the argument is that the Congress parties, Communist Party and the ANC, used them pretty much as a tool for mobilizing, but didn't return the favor, didn't accept that their issues were as important as issues of liberation, didn't accept that mobilizing workers was a path to the liberation of South Africa. In itself, mobilizing workers was giving strength back. It was taking people who had been repeatedly pushed down, every time they got pushed down, and giving them the spirit to carry on. The argument is that they were just simply used to pad out the stairways called by the Congress Alliance. So the first, the stairways, so the three stairways of the 1957 that led up to the 1960s was first of all the pound a day. That was an enormous success, but it was an enormous success after there had been the Alexandra Bus Boycott. So you had the Alexandra Bus Boycott in Johannesburg, and then shortly after that followed the campaign, the Stay Away for a Day, a pound a day. And workers came out and supported that 80% across Johannesburg, for Weertland and
What was it? I mean, On the day.
It was a campaign to get pound a day for pay, for wages.
Okay.
They got closer to it, but they never got. But that became a
So,
slogan.
so the slogan was, I just want to on the day, can I just get a pound a day?
Yeah. And then it was followed in 1958, and the call there was a part, no, forward to victory. Yeah, I mean, it's really wanted to know. Yeah. Yeah, so then that was when that pound a day was a success, the Congress movement looked at this and said, oh, you can really help us. So let's do a 3-day stay away next time. That was in 1958. And they wanted the workers to stay away for 3 days because the workers didn't have the resources. They could do 1 day, but to do 3 days was asking too much.
So the unions were asking the workers to stay away for 3 days.
Yeah, well, the Congress members had said, we are calling a national stay away for 3 days. And said to the unions, we'll see the SAC to make sure your people come along and support this. Right. So that was a problem, that it was too long, it was 3 days. But more than that, it was the way that it was publicized and put forward as one of the slogans was the Nats must go. And how it was understood was that, oh, the Nats must go. The United Party should take over rather.
So that's international.
Nationalist, because it was organized to coincide with white elections. Okay, so it was like this big thing coming out and saying, Nats must go. And, people said, oh, you want the white people to vote for the United Party? Which was just as racist, just a more liberal kind of racist. Yeah, so it didn't have support amongst workers. They did not feel recognized. And it was called off after, I think the first day it was called off, was seen as a complete disaster. And everyone went back to work. And that's kind of undermining, is tremendously demoralizing for, you've taken, you've had success with the pound a day. You have that spirit. And now you're going to undermine it further. So, and then the 1960s, which were particularly awful. You had the Socl massacre in 1960. 21st of March. 22nd. 22nd. 21st of March, yeah. Shortly after the Socl massacre, there was the launch of the armed struggle, a recognition that there was no space for peaceful negotiation. There was no possibility of protesting and lobbying for support. That the time had gone, and that now we move to an armed struggle. And in that decision, it was pretty much recognized from that moment on, everyone is a wanted, is a wanted person. Everyone in the organization, it's a thing of, yes, you are firmly supported, but you also realize that you are no longer safe in this country. And predictably, I mean, union leadership was just decimated.
NK.
Yeah.
At this time, the union is still divided into class. Race.
Race, oh yeah. No, there's still race. I mean, of the registered unions that joined Socl, there's 14 unions. There would have been, probably there were some white people in those unions, but so few. And I mean, it was also Indians and colours were allowed to register unions, so those unions might have been representing Indian and coloured workers. Indian or coloured, and they too were racially segregated.
I guess that's what makes this an interesting discussion. Like particularly for South Africa, you know, because typically union workers, labor class.
Labor class, yes, it's a class thing.
But yeah, that's what traditionally labor and class is about. But then South Africa happens and there's politics, so you've got unionism up here, politics up here, class and race. So there's two different streams to organizing people in.
Although race has often frequently been used as a way to legitimize class. Irish immigrants to the US were regarded as not white. Irish people in the UK, in Britain, sorry, not Britain, in England, still feel that because of their accents, they are yeah, they are lesser. They are not given the same opportunities. Yeah. White Afrikaners and white English speakers. I mean, the divisions there. You know, the white Afrikaners, who were the poor, there was a minority of incredibly wealthy, you know, the big companies, but the majority of white Afrikaners were extremely poor. So in the white community, English speaking, we have a separation. In Durban, there's one Afrikaans school. And it's like the Afrikaans kids and the English kids do not mix at all. And it's supposed to be a class, but it's a class thing. I know it's changed.
Yeah.
So there were mass arrests and, well, there were arrests, there was elimination, there were just execution of people. It was a horrible, horrible time. Everyone was banned, strikes were banned, and ANC and PAC were both banned. And everything went kind of quiet, or kind of quiet. There was intense repression. So when you look at it in terms of that, it's understandable that for the next, I think they say 8 years or so, there was very, very little mobilization, very little evidence of resistance, although there was still resistance. But you had the increasingly severe application of the pass laws, so that now you had to, you know, it was keeping African families out of urban areas because that made a joke of the whole, they don't really live here. It was the disenfranchising. It was saying they are not citizens of South Africa. Black people are citizens of their own homelands. Okay. So yeah, it was a very elaborate social engineering. Yeah, and making sure that there was no that there were very, very few opportunities for white and black people to interact. That white people who existed in white urban areas or alongside white areas were not a community. They didn't have a family. Yes, if there was a child born in the urban area, they could stay there until they were 18. And then they must leave. You know, and the restrictions under, you know, Section 10 rights. If you had Section 10 rights to stay in an urban area like Soweto, okay, if you had those rights, you kept on to them. You made damn sure that you didn't lose that, and you would, if you lost your job, you would lose your Section 10 rights. Although, no, I think Soweto, yeah. Soweto was officially a township. But that was, yeah, urban area. Would have been on, yeah. I stand to be corrected there.
No, but you're correct. You're correct because the police used to conduct raids in Soweto. To find people with that, like, you see that my uncle, what I was telling you about. Apparently, one of my mother's aunt's husbands, right? The way he used to hate my uncle, he used to be the one who reports him to the police. Like when he shows up, he used to stay in zone 5, middle left zone 5. And my great grandmother's house was in zone 2. He used to literally send the police to zone 2 when my uncle was gone, for them to go and arrest him and kick him out of. Every time when my uncle came in, that in-law used to send the police to come and make sure he gets kicked out. So it was terrible.
Even in Soweto.
Even in Soweto.
As well. No, just gross.
And the other thing, you see, you don't understand. We used to, I think maybe because we had that one, and the government looked like it was flourishing, and it was easy to accept it. That time, you know, at least that one, my movie makes it looks nice. You know,
Yeah. It goes, it's, yeah.
You know? But that concept of African foreigners from white South Africa, it's like now I'm thinking, no wonder there are people that rejected, they vehemently rejected the concept of Pakistan because of the fact that you were literally making us foreigners in our own country.
Yeah.
By relegating us to these small portions of the country that you say that the Tswanas must belong there, everyone must belong there.
There's a lot history of, to somehow try and legitimize this, that, oh no, these people have never liked each other, the Socls always hated the Xhosas, etc. And going, the lineage, the arranging of the lineage, the traditional leaders.
Was it maybe a question of divide and conquer?
It was dividing conquer, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It really was.
I just didn't know that.
No. No, this is why, I mean, yes, it's in a dire situation, but there is no way anyone can say that it was anything like that. And youngsters don't get it. And I'm talking about people 20 years younger than me. They don't look like they're young, but they can say things like, oh, it was better under the lights. And it's just like, no. It's like saying Hitler was such a bad man. It is, especially when you look back on it, it's hard to imagine that we went through this. And the other kicker is that this is the time in South Africa as well. This is when the economy really exploded. And as soon as it was clear that the white people had control, that they weren't going to be overthrown, you had foreign direct investment come flooding in, because where else can you pay labor so little that you pay for only the person, not their family? Because a living wage, is not just one person's eating expenses. It's their expenses to live like a human being, to go to the movies, to have a family, to send their children to school. That's what a wage is. A living wage is meant to reproduce a house, a household, a society. With migrant labor, we're pushing people into bantustans and the forced removal so that you can only come in if you have a job. You are only allowed in for the period of that job, and your family does not come with you. You can pay wages, and the argument is that, well, you can pay these low wages because the family survives on the land. And the family has land in the Bantustan. And that was it. So people in Bantustan worked harder. Pretty much, they subsidized the building of industry and urban lifestyle. And this is when you get those enormous Anglo-American Barlow World, those big companies that now are great big international giants. I mean, yeah,
They still do that.
I read one.
I don't know if it was an article in there. It's even like you read here, no, I think when your mind is not focused on this thing. What you're studying on this thing. Where the concept of this direct investment of foreign country companies, right? This article, whatever that we made, was saying that when Microsoft establishes an office in South Africa, like when they want to save costs, when there's a recession in America, they move a lot of their operations overseas. But they don't pay their overseas laborers what they pay their American laborers because of the fact that they're trying to make sure that they save costs here and they retain their image in America.
Yes, so
So
America
yes.
still likes them.
Yes, we are subsidizing their offices in America because they have more labor.
Yeah, they're able to make more profit, which then enables them to carry on employing in America.
This is just globalization. I mean, let's be honest. We're
Yeah.
being very
No,
different.
it's divided.
Yeah, we literally are remain third world because, because we continue to be used as,
Yes.
and third world.
Yeah,
You know.
and with the increasing casualization of labor, that paying for the individual is now made to the company. Because you pay only for the work that person does. There's no sense of, well, a monthly wage. And someone, I don't know what the monthly wage is. They have many different jobs. You know, like, this place is one job that I do. I have other jobs that I do. I have one other job. But to be true, I mean, it's very difficult to put two of them together. But it's considered a part-time job. You know, so you pay far, far less than what you would have to pay if that was a full-time position. Let alone the medical aid and the pension and, yeah,
But aren't we being driven into that
yes,
after COVID?
yeah.
Now when it's been made to seem it's okay now.
Yeah.
to hold
Being
on
at
to
work, there's no need.
hybrid.
Yeah, hybrid,
Ah.
yeah. Yeah, so you can cut back on the people in your offices.
Plus, you're not paying rent.
You don't pay them. Yeah, less cleaners, less telephone lines, yeah. And it shifts the cost right over to your workers. You know, all of a sudden, they're storing the paperwork that they need for their job.
Sorry, I'm keeping up size now.
Are you good?
My studio is this big, okay, guys, and look up, it's this big, not really, it's this big.
Yeah.
Because you have to pay now, you know,
That, you have, yeah,
this is, I'm paying for these expenses now.
they will fight it.
Yeah.
Apparently, you have to make very little sure that that area is never used for
Anything else,
Yeah.
because I should have had a lot of people, but I'm like, no, I'm gonna pay.
No, that's it. And also, I mean, with globalization and companies like Amazon, they're gonna pay, you know, they do everything possible to get out of paying tax. So they're also screwing the rest of it, you know, everyone. It's like they're using our resources, they're using our people, they're using our education system, they're using our health system, they're using our social welfare system to make themselves well. Yeah.
But also like defining yourself as a country, it's also, it's racist.
Yes.
Like going America, England.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
defining yourself.
Yeah.
Also, it's a sense of tribalism. It's also, it's creative capitalism to come separate people.
And, you know, about, nationalist spirits, actually, and this usually them out. And this is it. I read something today around, immigration. Someone pointed out that, the restrictions on people's ability to move has got to the point where it's inhuman, that you can't dream about becoming anyone. You can't dream about visiting different countries. No, they won't take you in unless you are wealthy enough, as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the mass hordes out there are trying to get into our countries.
It just creates further separation.
Yeah.
Which creates.
Yeah. And it appeals to that right-wing nationalism,
Yeah.
which identifies the other as the enemy. Yeah, I mean, and you know, when you think of this, if you go back, you think about this, the taking away the citizenship, that African people became foreigners in white South Africa.
Who was that? Who said that? Denizens.
Denizens, yeah, well,
Who
yes.
said that? What,
Alan Paton.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
I was lost. So denizens, but that was the thing, right? Sorry, that's what it means, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so,
I'm so frightened.
oh, so,
Pretty sure. No, he was writing in 1990.
I know, it wasn't, it was, it's a South African dude, I think.
No, no, see,
No.
oh,
Anyway,
okay. But yes, yes. And South Africa, you know, what considered itself white South Africa, got really wealthy off using that labor and then saying, oh, no, but you're not really belonging to us, so we don't have to pay for your educational health care or anything else. And experiencing. So then where do you draw the boundaries? When South Africa has always depended on migrant labor from Southern Africa, from everything up to the Sahara, has been, all of those people have been migrant laborers in South Africa, building our economy. Much like we are building Amazon in America. And now we're going to say, no, but you can't have it. And so, yeah, we're still fighting for citizenship. And that is very, very real. I mean, it's a real problem because Black people in South Africa do not have the rights of citizenship. Citizenship, access to resources, the public resources of your country. If you are a citizen, you have a right to those public resources. But that's not the case in South Africa. It's only the case if you're wealthy enough to live in a nice area and be able to afford security and schools and everything else. So it's like Black people in South Africa are still fighting for their citizenship rights. So they look to outsiders and say, oh, no, me first, which is very understandable. The problem is that those people also have rights. You know, you can't actually draw that line. It's like, you know, we're citizens of the damn world. And with climate change, that is becoming so much more obvious that America and Europe got wealthy. And, you know, it's like they have prospered and we've are feeling the effects. You know, it's destroying our land. So it's a case of, well, to what extent can you ever say, this is a boundary and everything I do here is all mine and has no impact on you over there? You know,
well, mines.
Nigerian mines. Slave.
Oh, no, it's just that, you know, the oil has just been extrapolated for centuries, well, not quite centuries, but for years and years and years, white wealth has gone back into that country.
That's it.
Okay, I mean,
What
that whole
was-
political situation is a,
Yeah, and people
It's
have
not-
been dispossessed of it. It's not like they have benefited.
no,
No.
from, well, I mean, South Africa is a perfect example. Like, we just export all our material to
Yeah.
for other people to make money.
Yeah. And the mines, Cynthia Carroll,
was when she was head of Anglo American, she stopped the dividend payments. And there was general outcry because Anglo American had never not given dividend payments to their shareholders. Yeah? Now they got really good pretty quickly, and they brought back the dividends, but it's the workers who are digging, why don't they just give something back? Yeah, what is a shareholder but someone with enough money to buy that share? They're not the worker, all they have is capital, and Anglo American didn't need the capital, they existed. Now we've just made every individual person complicit, and we're trying to tie them in and say, well, you all benefit from it. And then we do benefit from it.
What do you think about this discussion in the way white people have gotten this far? And I'm just thinking about this strong growth in the 60s that it's created generational wealth.
Yes.
Right? And when Sarah says they want to impose tax on the wealth, you're thinking, you guys must just give back some of the money that your grandparents made for you in 1960.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you ask yourself, what do you do with 1 trillion? How much what's the bank? And I must have, what do you do with 1 trillion? Like, what do you really do with 1 trillion? What do you do with it? As a family individual, what do you do with it? And what?
It's just something about keeping it in the family. What? You have some, it's that genetics thing that somehow your progeny the progeny will get you anyway. And it's that. Whether or not you leave the money, but it's a real issue. It's also, I'm seeing ways that people are finding to, buy policies that either children car when they're turning 60, 20, or whatever after I'm dead. It's like, okay, so you pay for that now, and you're not paying tax. It's not a death, because there's tax when you leave money. If you can spend your money now, people only receive the benefits 10 years after you've died. Does that avoid death duties? Everyone insists that no, you get taxed on what you earn now. But I'm convinced that's a tax. Yeah. But it's everywhere, if you look at the wealth across countries, the wealth of Europe, that there's no, there's a great map. I'll put it up for you tomorrow. That shows countries not in terms of their geographic size, but in terms of their consumption size. Okay, so it takes an area like Britain. Britain is perfect because it is so tiny, and it makes it swell. So it's written with this enormous fat stomach because they have literally sucked out the wealth. It's. And then immigration laws say, no, you can't come into that. It's just so depressing. God. No, it don't. It drives me nuts. But I mean, the thing is that it's, I just keep on remembering that damn book that says, yeah, we all protest that capitalism is going to be the death of us. It cannot continue. But in our actual lives, we act like it will. It's like we intellectually understand, but then we go out and use out of the same thing. We don't go out tomorrow and act differently. We don't go out tomorrow and give away money, which is pretty much it. That it's that complicity, and it's same thing with the shop steward, you know, it's,
Like my sister.
it's one life. Yeah. Ah. It does get very depressing. Okay, so the lessons were organize factory base first. If you go into politics, make sure that your factory base is strong before you move away from it. If they had that mass base that they imagined, they would have been able to continue. Perhaps it wouldn't have got to a position of an armed struggle. Perhaps the government would have been forced to this. That's blaming trade unions for a lot, though. Independent worker politics. This is where, and this now is a major theme in the next 3 lectures. Okay? And this is a major theme for your main assignment. That it's worker politics. It was, the argument goes, it's not an undisputed argument, but the one line of the argument goes that if SAP2 hadn't have joined with the Alliance movement, then they would have stuck to their knitting and they would have focused on workers' issues and workers' interests, and they would have built the factory floor instead of saying to workers, there's bigger interests at play here. We are asked to come out and sacrifice for the good of the national liberation struggle. You know, wasn't that they joined the armed struggle? Or was it just an inevitable consequence of diluting your priority? Although they couldn't separate the priority.
I don't think you can separate
Exactly, yes.
if there's impact you need.
Yeah, as Conrad says, the issues impact you. You couldn't have separated that worker issue from the politics. They were one and the same. But it begs the question, what about now? You know, unions again are being asked to calm down, to not make, to not make things difficult, to build the national economy.
But I think if I look at it, find it out, ANC, but that was fighting the revolution. Then you've got Socl with the means of SACP, which was a part of it. I think what probably was supposed to happen is that at some stage, ANC was supposed to let go and let either the party or that's the SACP take over to drive the chain of people, rights, workers, getting us to this new, whatever it is, ideology, whatever we're supposed to. Because at the moment, I think they're caught up between being liberation, being a party, and solving worker issues.
But that's a bigger thing around that whole relationship between the SACP, ANC, and Socl. Yeah.
I think for me, the struggle of the shop students, the one way they individualize, they attend individual problems.
Yeah.
Outside the scope of the.
They lose sight of the same culture. Yeah.
I think that I tend to agree with the need for workers in this business, workers to put aside their individual challenges to attend the bigger cause. You see, we're striking today as in 1965 for us to have better wages. We have better wages for everyone making money. Now, tomorrow we'll be striking to have better wages, working for something else. Like this business already important,
But rather than a consolidate.
you could not consolidate it because of the fact that legislation was the problem. There was a framework that was creating the problem. So we're busy attending these little things here, when we needed to attend the big picture that gave rise to these little struggles.
Yes, but this is back to Conrad's point about one of those parties is meant to
Continue that struggle.
continue or step forward.
So I think if the position that we see take.
You know, with that long-term vision.
They've done the action,
Yeah.
but now they got up in chapters, start, workplace, policies and whatnot, which was not the agenda when all these three people came up.
Well, this is why today, we've
Yeah.
got Twins, going, I'm not aligned to Kasatu. Kasatu are aligned to the ANC. And then that's where the politics gets confusing because,
So,
so.
What do we say?
so you've got,
Two-state revolution.
yes,
It's the national democratic struggle that the Communist Party, who we all say, and we are so disbelieving when the Communist Party is not for the workers. Okay, Communist Party, which, if they say it, then the unions must agree.
Yeah.
But it's part of the bigger picture of this moving forward to the revolution after the national democratic revolution. So we build the national democracy where black people become capitalists. Okay, so that we get rid of that white-black division. Okay, and then the working class can actually be a working class because they won't be separated and divided across color. And then we'll have the socialist revolution. What's not to my children's children's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but you can see it slowly happening now. Percentage is going down.
Mm.
And if they don't do anything about it, then who knows what happens?
Yeah. However, at the same time, we must remind ourselves that no one controls the world. There's, things are unpredictable. Yes, we see a trajectory, but that doesn't mean it continues forever.
Yeah, this point has to come to.
That as well. Yeah.
So when I look at this, it's almost like that workers are the only people who can actually change anything.
Well, what? Because we're putting such an emphasis on trade unions, and that's where the,
How,
Because of the bureaucracy. Without the bureaucracy of the structure that is being provided by bureaucracy, you will not be able to mobilize effectively.
no, you can't.
So
You can
what,
mobilize, but you have to have a smart talker. You have to have the golden tongue.
yeah, but I think the advantage of a union is that it provides some longevity of sorts to that organization, where if you go and become a smooth talker to the community, right? When you finish that activity, they disband it.
Yeah.
And then next time must come again and smooth talk them again. Whereas with the union, that structure of as a union, we are going to support this cause. When this cause shows up, whether this month, next month, 3 years down the line, as long as it's still our mandate to support this cause, the union is moving forward. So you've got this captured audience of sorts in the structure that the union provides. Unlike with the community can love you today and hate you tomorrow. I mean, I don't owe you anything. I'm not paying a subscription membership, I don't think anything from you. So I think the role of the union is that it provided the bureaucracy within the union structure allows the armed struggle to tap into a force that can be mobilized because it's a leadership.
That's a very good argument. Yes, but the danger of the bureaucracy is that bureaucracies are wonderfully effective and efficient. But if that bureaucracy is captured, it is the most powerful tool to then wield for your own, well, for a particular agenda.
Yeah, exactly, correct.
It's almost like grabbing the head. And removing the head.
Yeah, we should agree to the stuff to make with the tripartite alliance. The bureaucracy formed, made, built these three parties together, the bureaucracy brought these three parties together. But then when you look at the effectiveness of the tripartite alliance for the worker, you start to question whether it benefits the worker. Like, it benefits more the agenda that has been put forward, more than it benefits the workers.
But yeah, I mean, no, no, most, yes. But then, then I start to think, well, is that maybe not like the people saying, well, the ANC has done nothing for workers? And we're saying that this government is as bad. And it's not that. No, you see, that's the Republican struggle. Except that, yeah, I mean, yes, the ANC did drive the liberation struggle, but they weren't the only drive.
Can somebody please believe in that? The fact that they were not the only ones who won our freedom.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just think, for example, I listen to so when it comes, and then he says, I'm speaking as the NEC, that is the president of the country. Only let's just confirm. From the start.
Yeah, because it's not being seen.
Yeah, but he's the one driving the agenda, so he's the one, if something's not done, it's him lacking the will, or his party lacking the will. I will to do something.
It's the emphasis on this party is democratic. We all take a decision and who am I to, as one single person to, but it's not like that. I mean, we know that at the higher reaches, there are divisions, and that is not a case of the, the argument, the best argument wins. Yeah, it's like,
That's true.
oh my God.
I also think
Hmm?
white people are very smart when they were negotiating. Because at least when you see, I think you mentioned something about the growth of the economy, when it came to the concessions. Right. When it came to the negotiation of businesses and what's going to happen to the economy, all those things that were owned by the state.
Yeah.
Then they started to privatize.
Yes, also to get
Yeah,
privatized.
privatize, and then when,
Capital to Horizon.
yes, only them at the time. And then when they privatized, then they took
Yeah.
them overseas.
Yeah.
To protect and reduce their risk.
And then the wonderful thing of capitalism and how it just legitimizes everything so that white children cannot see their advantage. They say, how did I benefit from a project? And it's just so big that you can't. It's like, yeah. My husband keeps on saying to people, how many toilets did you have in your house? Yeah, but they don't, that doesn't, yeah. I mean, yeah, because capitalism says we're all individuals. So it's like, oh, don't take my waste, look at me as an individual. It's a really difficult thing because, I mean, yes, we don't want people to look at race, but the fact is that it's been there. It's been a racially established. It's like Dan Prince Harry going off and saying, oh, I don't want to be a royal anymore. So no, you got the hard end of the straw. But what a lovely problem to have. You're a royal, okay? It's like you benefited until you what, like 38, and then decide, and now you're going to say, oh, no, I just want to be an individual. But no, you don't get that chance. You were born into it. The whole thing of royalty is that you're born into it. You can't then elect not to be born into it.
And we can't just hit in there because they need.
Huh?
We can't just hit you. I'm just saying. You're loyal. There's someone protecting you. Someone prepaid there's something somewhere to protect you. So you cannot be an individual because an individual you can slap them at the back of their head.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of think that not even their parents can do that. Oh,
Well, that's
Okay.
like it was teacher.
okay.
Right, this is an argument, because, okay, the arguments that you've been raising now come up in the formation of, well, unions through the seventies, and then the formation of the society with that dedicated possession of we support the alliance, we are part of the alliance. Right? So through the seventies, you have a move away from it. You have a building of workers' committees on the ground. Okay? You have Versace, who I grew up thinking that Versace was like nasty people because they didn't want to be political. Okay? And what you actually read is that Versace built very powerful worker structures on the floor by saying, no, we are not having anything to do with political parties. If we are political, we have our own independent political party and workers' interests. This is, goes into the rest of the subject matter that you're looking at. And these quotes are one of the reasons why that worker control of trade union is so important. Okay? The argument is that it's not just that democracy is good and that workers should be able to organize and fight for their own interests and oligarchy is bad. The bigger picture is that worker organization goes some way to enabling people to undo what capitalism has done. It goes some way to enabling people through the process of organization and taking control of the working conditions of deciding how you are going to protest and what you're going to protest about and how your organization is going to be run. That taking control over your liberation is what is the clearest sense of coming back to that understanding of yourself as a person, not as a commodity piece of labor. We all judge ourselves in terms of our jobs. We all judge ourselves in terms of our money and how much we earn. It's like we look at ourselves as commodities. We don't see that we are valuable outside of that. Yeah, we all live in a society that says you are as valuable as you are worth. And wealthier people are worth more. They are more valuable. The social and psychological impacts of the transformation of persons into commodities is fear and anxiety, producing insecurity, negative self-worth, loss of meaning and identity, depression, relationship and family breakdowns. Yeah, with negative self-worth, you can do nothing. You can't get up and start a job, even if you did have a basic income grant. And that Fromm, who is a very famous psychology theorist, reveals how commodity relations are reinforced when workers are rendered voiceless in corporations and in the political processes. Such a negation attacks the essence of what it means to be a person, for human beings are defined by their capacity to think and reflect. The situation is compounded if workers join bureaucratically structured unions, which also deny voice. And that is why you see in the 1970s and the 80s an emphasis on the importance of worker organization. So that, yeah, decisions aren't taken quickly and it doesn't move efficiently. But that's because the decision is, it's like the journey is important. It's that sort of thing. The process of deciding the decision is the important thing. It's like if we could all
actually debate our values, if we could discuss whether or not it was a good idea to eat dogs, and we could, argue amongst ourselves. The truth is not what matters. What matters is that we hear what other people think, and that we try and defend it. We try and put up an argument and say, I believe my culture to do X, Y, Z is good. And all we do is just open that to other people. If we are willing to discuss it, what the outcome is not the issue. The process of doing it makes us human social beings rather than desperately scared someone is going to take away your culture or your wife or your money. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so if you then have to think about, okay, so how do you feel about your main assignment now?
I think, are we going to fit all these topics?
That is the difficulty.
The key question is around like, basically, do you think trade unionism is still,
Yeah,
is there fragmentation? Do they
Yeah.
have the power that they?
Mhm.
Right,
Yeah.
that, is it dying? Is there still power in trade unions?
Yeah.
Like, can you still mobilize with them? Yes, yeah. Can they become obsolete? Yeah. Sure. I mean,
There are many different ways to contain it. Okay. Bear in mind that what you're trying to do is demonstrate your understanding of what's covered in the course. So while you could take a stand that says, why do we expect this of unions? Okay. If you take that position and say, why do we regard unions as the most important mobilizing social movement? Then you focus on the early stuff that we did in the first lecture around organization building and where organizations are built. And where are the new social movements emerging from? Do they have the capacity that unions don't? Or you look at unions and say, well, they will, rather than, you say work is incredibly important, and work is how, I mean, yes, we are human by making decisions, but we are humans by, we alter our environment, we manipulate it to, if you think about animals do all the other things that we do. They dream, they have societies, they have families, they do all that. It's not being social, it's not communicating that makes us humans. It's not even using tools, because even, apes use tools. So do cats. Well, I don't know about cats, but I mean, I've seen other animals use tools. But humans create differently. They mold a society. No, sorry, not a society. They mold our physical environment. You shape things. Okay? You build a house. You dig a road. You make a dress. It's that creation that is so good, which is part of the reason why the argument is that work is an essential part of our lives, and that we have to see work as beyond. Work is not employment. Work is much broader than employment. Yeah.
and like you said, we just told work is like, for example, identity, right? You link yourself to who you are based on what you do. A lot of people strive to become a doctor, to become vet or a teacher, whatever it is. Like that is something that has now is part of who you are, it's part of your identity. So,
You also just go back to the alienation part.
Yeah, the alienation of the only existing to what you've done, that only a machine, only a robot is defined in terms of what they do. Okay, think of work more broadly. Think of work that is what you're employed to do. Think of work as listening to a friend go on and on about something because you know that they need to get that out. Okay, that's work. It's emotional work. Being nice to the horrible old lady on the street because you know that actually she needs help and, you know, you're just going to actually not argue this one. All right. It's that we work every day. We're working to negotiate with each other, to be human beings, to be social. In addition to feeding families and rearing children and just think of the marital disharmony when one parent does all the children. Yeah, because it's like, it doesn't matter how much money you bring to the party, it's like the money is not all of the work. Yeah. And it's that. So yes, work is incredibly important. And then we can say, okay, so maybe work is always going to be something that we're organizing on. So perhaps it won't be trade unions like we see, because I mean, work is changing, that even the employment work is changing. We are more often casualized. We are part-time workers. We're not sitting in a factory waiting to be organized into a workers' committee, into a union. So perhaps the way that we will organize will be different. And maybe that will still be around issues of some form of work. Yeah, and then the bureaucracy discussion, that's another very good area that you can take this into, which you'll see, you know, if you read the end parts of that's, what's that? Yeah, yeah, there you go, yeah, the end parts of that, and that's it, thank you, yeah. That he points out that when it comes to the community movements and the liberation struggle, decisions had to be taken quickly. They were taken underground. You could not, you know, it was a ban. You weren't allowed to be involved in the liberation struggle, and that just took that strong feeder, that strong participation from workers. And yeah, you can see that yeah, it became, you know, that decision is taken at the top, that it doesn't work to have true participatory democracy. We need representative democracy. Maybe we shouldn't even call it representative democracy. But of course, since it's not a politics, it's yeah. So there's a lot of teachers that argue around that too. You know, also that people are changing, that shop stewards must be of the people. So yes, shop stewards will change along with the people that they represent, as will movements, as will organizations will change, and the problems change and the opportunities change. You are quite right that your main problem is going to be focusing. Yeah, because there's too much for you to discuss. All right. You have two chances at this. So you do your assignment, I mark it and tell you how to improve it. You then improve it for the exam and you resubmit.
So, but then for the exam, something's going to be doubling words.
No, you're not doubling words, no.
It's literally fixed.
You fix it, okay? The other courses have much smaller word allowances. Okay,
I mean, it's still, I'm giving you a maximum, I will stop reading at 1,500, so I'm setting it at 1,400.
This is.
No, this essay, whatever I've written down is what I say. I'm talking about, the second part of the speech. Yeah, and the exact, yeah, that sort of thing. So whatever I've written down is what I've followed.
Okay, you gave us 800 to 1,200.
Yeah.
You type 1,800.
But you're that, okay, oh, you looking at that?
Yeah.
Yes, so don't. Physical. Yes, so 800 to 1,200 words, yes.
That's the one for the second.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got to focus, you've got to decide what your focus is. And if you are, I mean, look, you get the marks for going deep, not for going wide. But you've got to show awareness of the context, all right? So you find ways to say, this is the context that we're in, and you identify a couple of things, and then you dive down deep. As long as you identify and show that awareness of that context and say, look, this is going to be my focus. There are many things that I can talk about here. Okay? And I mean, this is done within one short paragraph. And then you say, this is going to be my focus. And we then focus on it. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier to write, and strangely enough, it's a lot easier to write a lot than it is to write a little.
When is this process? My time was weeks.
When is it? What are you asking? When is the exam?
I'm saying, what is the difficult to me?
It's like 2 weeks.
2 weeks,
Well, it's 2 weekends.
2 weekends.
Yeah. Then final thing. It's not bad. Next weekend.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do with the reflection pieces, to make you take a position, answer a question. You know, so that you get down to having a position. Because that's it. You have to be interested in what you write. You don't, otherwise you won't do a good job. Yeah, so if we go back to the what issues, areas of life were trade unions active in before the 1970s?
Oh, you talking about this?
Mhm.
This question?
Mhm.
Okay. What is it?
Wages, when you look at the.
Wages.
Wages.
Yeah.
Living conditions.
Conditions that they're living in.
Laws, family, living conditions. That's the last one.
Households.
And movements.
Skilled work.
Skilled work. Yes. The ability to negotiate through formal channels.
Because that wasn't.
That was not allowed, and that you were
Yes.
to recognize unions and. Yeah.
Yes, to be able to be recognized and able to work with the same machinery that everyone else will.
Works for.
Yeah. And then how did this shape their role in the liberation of South?
That watershed moments, when they decided they are going to ignore, they're going to ignore the formal process, the legislative processes
Okay.
for them to deal directly with their employers. Gave impetus to the power that the workers were able to wield. And that power that they were now able to wield is what was harnessed by the regulation struggle.
That's a good argument. Yeah, that recognition Yeah, the 1955.
Where they were like, and she was like,
Yeah,
oh,
it
we're not
was
making
like the second grade was a kind of, we're not actually
The official channels to nutrition.
official channels on the way, yes. That did change there, then when they started to see then they put energy into focusing on mobilizing the.
And also, there's a point that was made that because of the experience that Socl had, it then provided leadership, key leadership to the liberation
Yeah.
from that experience.
And it also meant that the unions that followed had a more contentious relationship with their engagement with political parties. You know, it wasn't that they weren't political, they were still political, just not to align with the political parties. Yeah. Let me see if there are any questions. Any questions over there? Oops. This is where it would be useful for people to write their questions. I know it's more difficult to write. But it's still there afterwards, you know, which is the problem with talking. That, I mean, even with the recording of the lecture, I'm pretty sure that you are going to be looking at the recording and you're not going to necessarily remember the sense that it was, you know, the whole discussion. I don't know how well it translates when you come back to a recording.
Just like, I've only ever had sociology lectures online. So this is a new forum for me. Having a discussion has been eye-opening. It's like,
Yeah, you see, I mean, that's
I would be
asked on you to make the lecture. And so I mean, yes, I can walk in, and this is where I hate overheads. So you walk in, you have a predefined thing, you know what you're going to be saying here and here and here. But actually, it's far more interesting and far more useful for all of us to have you shape it. You know, because I learn things, and I mean, you have different ways of looking at things.
I think I appreciate it in ways.
yeah.
Yes.
It's also just different, like, we just, yes, I just live in our own bubbles, like,
Yes.
I don't want any, but I just want to stay in there. So coming here and seeing other people, hearing what other people do, a lot of shocked because I really contact you on, oh, wow, shit, I've never had to engage with that in my life. Like, that's a lot, because I worked literally for myself.
Yeah.
I've stayed as far away from
Yeah.
corporates as much as possible.
Yeah.
Like,
I always thought that I was a very unsociable person. And I realized that no, actually, now people.
it's small doses.
Maybe, but certainly I like them more than I am wary of. Yeah, they're fun. Just, they're interesting. Okay, so, finished early. Just let me check and see there are no other questions. No, okay. All right. I look forward to seeing reading your.
Sorry, say that again, it's my tutorials.
No, we're saying how many do you have to write?
Two. Oh, two. You only have to write two, but if you want to, you can write anything. So if you start up one, you can write,
You've got another chance.
but you only, I'm only going to take 2 marks. Your 2 marks, yeah. And I have, there are people in the class who haven't submitted any, so there's going to be potentially an issue, but we'll deal with that when we come to it. Yeah. Okay, so you've only got another 2 weeks. You've got this week
And next one.
and the next one, yeah.
Next week, will it be our final lecture, and then the last one will be number 7, or will it be?
No.
2 more full lectures?
No, you have 2 more full lectures. On the last lecture, we have 2 more lectures, yes. Okay. But for the last lecture, you don't have to do this. There isn't a reflection piece because you're going to be busy with your thing. So pretty much